Welcome to Serbia, gde Murija ubija, gde nema pravde ni za lek i samo Bog je sudija. Sve ima svoju cenu, nema ništa u poštenju. Umesto da se igraju klinci i siglaju u venu.
Welcome to Serbia, a country where conflict is plentiful and it's more or less impossible to keep the country and its people out of trouble for more than 5 years. So if you're from a normal country and don't pay much attention to the Balkans, which good for you by the way, Serbia has been hit with the George Floyd treatment, aka there have been riots and all-out battles with the police. But unlike the riots in America that started from alleged racism in the police force, which ended up in the murder of a dark-skinned individual, in Serbia it's about COVID, the president, and all-out show that is the Serbian government. To understand why the Serbian people went out to the streets, we gotta go back, all the way back to the 90s. If you're a loyal follower of this channel, you're pretty much aware of the amazing state the Balkans were in the 90s, called the Yugoslav Wars, where Yugoslavia chose to break up and kill each other on the basis of their geographic ancestry and religion, which in the end left the ex-Yugoslav countries weak and fairly easily exploitable. And that exploitation came in the political sense, as there was a power vacuum in all of the newly born republics, especially in Serbia. So over the years, politicians came and went using their office powers to allegedly make money magically disappear from the budget, to buy up the media so it's all government owned, and sell precious natural resources and factories to foreigners. Now in 2020 we had, just like the rest of the world, a medical crisis known as the Wu flu, which devastated countries worldwide as it forced them to shut down and sit at home for a couple of months. Serbia was one of the first countries to shut everything down, put in martial law and have some strict measures so as not to have the virus spread. It was kind of successful. While Italy, Germany, France and Spain were imploding internally, Serbia was more or less stable with some economic damage. However, election time was near and we all know what that means.
Od sutra će biti zabranjeno svako javno okupljanje sa više od 5 ljudi, bilo u zatvorenom, bilo u otvorenom prostoru. A od petka idemo na dugački policijski sat, odnosno zabranu kretanja.
All of the safety measures disappeared 2 weeks before the elections, just like Jeffrey Epstein. And in these elections, the ruling party won 60% of the seats in the parliament, with the second most popular party only winning 10%. And the ruling party, aka SNS, won a majority in every province. Of course, this ruffled some feathers, considering SNS is a fairly controversial and non-popular party due to some of the scandals they put themselves in over the years, which you can check out in this video, but this wasn't enough to cause all-out chaos. What did break the camel's back though was that after the elections were over, COVID cases skyrocketed, and the government announced bringing back severe measures and blamed the people for their reckless behavior. And this sparked off the fire, where people tried to storm the parliament and ended up being gassed like the Untermensch in 1940s Germany. That's as far as context goes. If you want a more in-depth video, I highly recommend watching Serbian Mapping's video on the issue, as he has gone far and beyond explaining the complex politics plaguing these protests. However, what I can show you is the first-person perspective of these protests and how it actually feels to be on the ground when it hits the fan. So, the protests are held here by the National Assembly, and people gather around here. There are a couple of ways to get here. The most popular being from Terazije, which is a popular square in downtown Belgrade. However, I chose to came here through less popular streets, and as you come closer to the assembly you will hear whistles and overall people yelling. Once I arrived there, there were two major congregations of people. One to the right of the National Assembly, where mostly the religious crusaders came, and the other, far bigger one, to the left of the assembly by the National Post Office. The area in general was surrounded by police who were securing the parliament, which was the target of protesters the day before, so no one could storm it at all as it was heavily guarded. The police were basically sardines packed in front of it, and they had an outer ring of the popo guarding it, as well as a cavalry unit that stormed through the protesters as to thin them out, as you can see here. Now, as I mentioned before, the group here that I named the Crusaders were protesting against the quote-unquote treason that was being teased. That treason being the recognition of Kosovo as a sovereign state. A couple of days before, the president announced that there is some heavy pressure onto Serbia to start negotiations with Kosovo, which wouldn't end well for Serbia. So, if you're unfamiliar with the whole bollocks that is Kosovo, I highly recommend watching my video explaining the drama. Anyhow, this protest group was generally peaceful, some slurs against the president were thrown, but the majority of it was a bunch of people singing patriotic songs about Kosovo and holding banners tied to the Serbian Orthodox Church.
Hristos posredi nas! Kosovo, Kosovo, zemljo moja voljena, zemljo slavnih videzovala Zara I Miloša.
Some very powerful stuff. But then we entered into the left side protests. Now this group of protesters was heavily guarded. You had water cannons and police blocking their path from continuing to the parliament. And they were all just put in one area, and they grew and grew and grew, eventually heavily outnumbering the police. It was possible to enter this group from the side streets, which weren't being blocked by them, and when you entered there were mostly young people yelling and others just vibing. The protest here started off peacefully. People were chanting Vučiću pederu, which translates to Vučić, you faggot, a fairly common chant in Serbia, which is pretty funny if you're not a liberal. I mean, just imagine a bunch of people calling their president of their country a homophobic slur. Good times. Anyways, from there it started to escalate. People started bringing flares and firecrackers, which they would throw at the police. You also had this genius who decided to show off, most likely for clout and a chance to impress XX creatures known as women, and in an attempt to do so, the mad lad did some dance with the flare and then decided to throw it to the police. Except it barely traveled 10 meters and landed among the protesters, who then decided to beat his ass. So kudos to you, anonymous protester. Anyways, from that point on, people started vandalizing some signs, basically just taking the signs off. There were also a group of people that would organize and rush to the front line, attack the police and then rush back before they could retaliate. A garbage container got set aflame, as they usually do. But then after the police had enough tomfoolery from the protesters, they threw in the tear gas.
Ja sam u gasu sam, ja sam u gasu sam, ja sam u gasu sam, gasiram se Miki jako. Ja sam u gasu sam, ja sam u gasu sam, ja sam u gasu sam, gasiram se Miki jako.
Out of nowhere, you would just see people start running and this white gas would start spreading. And you wouldn't even have time to react, because as soon as you take one whiff of it, it starts burning your eyes, it starts burning your nose, and it starts burning your throat. You can't keep your eyes open at all from how hard they burn, and on top of that, the police starts going after the protesters, so you gotta run, having no idea where the f you're running to, because it's either that or getting beaten up by the ex-socialist police. If you ever wonder how f***ing pepper spray feels like, god damn, you just can't keep your eyes open because it's fucking horrible. It just keeps itching around your eyes and it hits your throat and you just want to throw up, cough, it's horrible. So after the gas was thrown, we ran into the side streets to escape it. The police followed and once again we were more or less surrounded. The protests there more or less died out, with people just staring at the police and then staring back. One guy among the protesters threatened to beat me up because I had a camera. And journalists aren't very welcome in Serbia, as most are controlled by the government, so you know. I escaped unscathed via diplomacy, thankfully. And yeah, there will be the Serbian protests and how it was to be on the ground among the protesters. Let me know what you think. Have you been to a protest? Have you ever had your human rights violated? Let me know in the comment section below. My name is Nick and you watch Living Ironically in Europe.
Išli smo u Afriku, da sadimo papriku, znate onu žutu, finu ali ljutu, znate onu žutu, finu ali ljutu. Jednog grba Kamila odmah se pomama.